For 70 years, if Canada needed a fighter jet, a helicopter, or any serious piece of military hardware, there was really only one phone call to make, and it went straight to Washington. That call is quietly getting rerouted. Sweden's Saab isn't just pitching Canada anymore. It's already in formal negotiations for a billion-dollar surveillance aircraft deal. NATO itself just backed an expansion of that deal at its own summit, and Airbus is exploring building an entire helicopter manufacturing plant inside Canada tied to an $18 billion fleet program. Canada's own government just published a defense strategy worth roughly $500 billion over the next decade, built explicitly around keeping as much of that money inside the country as possible instead of sending it to American contractors. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why America's defense industry should be nervous about what Canada is quietly building instead of buying American. Here's where we're headed. First, we'll break down the fighter jet saga, because Canada's review of its F-35 order has now grown into something much bigger than a simple jet swap. A possible 140 aircraft, three-tier Air Force built around Saab as much as Lockheed Martin. Then we'll get into the Global Eye surveillance deal and why NATO itself just stepped in to back Saab at its Ankara summit. After that, we'll cover Airbus and the massive helicopter competition worth billions, where European rotorcraft could soon be manufactured on Canadian soil for the first time. We'll look at Carney's own $500 billion defense industrial strategy and what it says about where Ottawa wants this money to go. And finally, we'll talk about why Ottawa is deliberately delaying the biggest decision of all until after the U.S. midterms, and what that alone tells you about how much trust is left in this relationship. Let's start with the jets, because this story has gotten far bigger than most people realize. Canada signed a $19 billion deal in January 2023 to buy 88 F-35A fighters from Lockheed Martin, with total program costs later estimated above $27 billion. Then, one day after becoming Prime Minister in March 2025, Carney ordered a full review, citing Canada's exposure to U.S.-controlled defense supply chains amid deteriorating trade relations. That review was supposed to wrap up by September 2025. It still hasn't. What's emerged instead, according to CBC News reporting from June, is a proposal that could expand Canada's planned fleet to roughly 140 aircraft total, a three-tier force pairing 70 to 88 F-35As for stealth missions with up to 72 Saab Gripen Es assembled in Canada for everyday air defense, plus Saab Global Eye aircraft for airborne surveillance. Saab has linked its combined offer to the creation of up to 12,600 Canadian jobs if final assembly and sustainment work land in Canadian facilities. One defense analyst put it bluntly this July, "A year ago, the Gripen argument sounded like a grievance from a competition Canada had already decided. It sounds very different now." And the clearest proof that Saab isn't just talk came on May 27th, when Carney confirmed Canada had entered formal negotiations with Saab for 5 to 6 Global Eye airborne early warning aircraft, a deal worth more than $5 billion Canadian dollars. Then, on July 7th, at the NATO summit in Ankara, the alliance itself announced negotiations with Saab for up to 10 more Global Eye aircraft, backing this Swedish program at the exact moment Canada is weighing whether to lean on it even further. Saab has also already proven its Canada-style manufacturing model works elsewhere, standing up a Gripen production line in Brazil with Embraer that rolled out its first Brazilian-built aircraft in March of this year. And Saab has a very practical reason to want a Canadian assembly hub too. Ukraine has expressed interest in more than 100 Gripens, and Saab simply doesn't have the manufacturing capacity in Sweden alone to meet that kind of global demand, which makes a Canadian production line valuable to Saab, regardless of how many jets Ottawa itself ends up buying. Now, let's get to helicopters, because this is an even bigger program in dollar terms, and it's unfolding on a similar track. Canada is preparing 3 separate major helicopter procurements at once, for the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Coast Guard, and the RCMP. At the center of it sits the Next Tactical Aviation Capability Set, or NTACS, expected to become Canada's largest helicopter acquisition since the Cold War ended, with broader government planning allocating up to 18.4 billion Canadian dollars for tactical aviation recapitalization. Bloomberg reported in May that Airbus is exploring building an entire helicopter manufacturing plant inside Canada specifically to compete for this program, offering platforms from the H145M up through the larger H225M Caracal. Airbus already employs more than 5,300 people directly in Canada, sustains roughly 27,000 jobs indirectly across the aerospace sector, and sources over 2 billion Canadian dollars annually from around 1,000 Canadian suppliers. This isn't a company chasing a single sale. Airbus is positioned as Canada's leading supplier of civil and parapublic helicopters already, supporting more than 830 aircraft for over 230 customers nationwide. And it's showcasing its latest defense technology right now at CANSEC, Canada's largest defense show. None of this is happening in a vacuum either. It's tied directly to deliberate government policy. Carney's defense industrial strategy, unveiled in February of this year, calls for close to 500 billion Canadian dollars in defense investment over the coming decade, with spending rising to the equivalent of 5% of GDP by 2035, and an explicit goal of keeping as much of that work as possible inside Canada, rather than shipping the money abroad. The fighter jet file has become the earliest, biggest test of whether Ottawa can actually convert that spending into a real domestic industrial base, and Saab and Lockheed Martin are now competing directly on that exact ground, one offering Canadian factories and jobs, the other offering the status quo. Here's the detail that tells you everything about how fragile American trust has become in Ottawa right now. Reporting indicates Canada's final fighter fleet announcement is likely being delayed until after the U.S. midterm elections in November, specifically to avoid further straining relations with Washington in the meantime. Think about that for a second. Canada's own government is timing one of its largest defense decisions in decades around the American political calendar. Not because it's unsure what it wants, but because it's actively managing how this decision lands in Washington. That's not the posture of a country still treating the United States as its default, unquestioned defense partner. That's a country carefully managing a partner it no longer fully trusts. To be fair, nothing here is finalized yet. The NTAC's competition remains in its options analysis phase, with initial deliveries not expected until the early 2030s, regardless of who wins. And Canada's fighter fleet decision is still officially under review rather than confirmed policy. Lockheed Martin and American suppliers still have a real path to keep significant pieces of these programs. But look at the direction every single one of these threads is pointing. A $5 billion global ideal already in formal negotiation. NATO backing an expanded Saab order at its own summit. Airbus offering to build an entire Canadian manufacturing hub. A $500 billion national strategy explicitly built around keeping defense dollars at home. None of that reverses easily, because once a European company stands up an assembly line on Canadian soil and starts training Canadian workers to build it, that industrial relationship doesn't just evaporate the next time a friendlier voice picks up the phone from Washington. So that's the full picture. Canada's military hardware, a category America once treated as an unquestioned lock, is now genuinely up for grabs across billions of dollars in live negotiations, and European companies are the ones actively winning ground. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, do you think American defense contractors ever win this ground back? Or is Canada's pivot toward Europe already too far along to reverse?